Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidhyakena yopakarottam pravaram muninam patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi stuve patanjalim vyasam shankaram cha munitrayam kartru sutrasya bhashyasya kramat vivaranasya cha. Right now we are almost in the middle of the 4th chapter, Kaivalya Pada. And in the last session, we just gave a brief introduction to this 24th sutra, which is a very important sutra. And it's also well known because Vyasa has written a very wonderful commentary on this sutra. Visheshadarshinaha Atma Bhava Bhavana Nivrittihi. So the central meaning is those who attain this proper understanding of the distinction between our mind and other evolutes of Prakriti on the one hand and Purusha on the other. Those who are able to understand the distinction between these two, and also realize the fact that Purusha alone is self-effulgent, mind and all other evolutes of Prakriti are only relative. Those who reach that level of proper understanding, what happens to them? They get freed from these conflicts and waverings of mind. That's what Vyasa says in his commentary. In other words, Vivekinaha, Vivekin is the Sanskrit, Vivekinaha is the 6th case, Sashti Vibhakti, first singular. What it means is the one who has attained this proper discerning wisdom through Viveka and Vairagya, through detachment, Abhyasa, practice, they get freed from the wrong notion that mind is everything. Mind is the only reality. It's a wrong notion. Again, it is a reference to the Vijnanavadin's assertion that mind is everything. Again, we should keep this in mind. This is a very important sutra. So we have to keep in mind the philosophical background. Why Patanjali and especially Vyasa in his commentary is referring to the Vijnanavada school, the subjective idealistic school of Mahayana Buddhism. They hold a view that mind is everything. And they think that mind is just a platform and all objects in the subjective world exist only so long as we have this awareness of those objects in our mind. It's called Chittam. So in this context, Chittam, Mana or mind, Vijnana, all these are used more or less in the same sense. Now, actually, Patanjali has reached one stage in his assertion that mind is just an evolute of Prakriti. And mind is able to recognize things only because it reflects the presence of Purusha. It reflects Atman. So very often the word Atma is used in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras and also in Vyasa's commentary in the sense of Purusha. So there is often mixing up of this term. They have to keep in mind, Atma is not actually a category accepted in the mainstream yoga system. But in some of the sutras and also in the commentaries, very often the word Atma is used in the sense the existing reality to mean Purusha. So I will just read the commentary because this commentary is well known among the scholars in the scholarly circles of Patanjali system. So that's why this commentary is very important. So Vishesha Darshinaha Atma Bhava Bhavana Nivurtihi. Vishesha Darshi is the one who sees the distinction between Purusha and Prakriti. In the sense, mind is an evolved of Prakriti, and some schools of Buddhism, later Buddhism, asserted that mind is everything, there is nothing beyond mind. You have to remember, Anattavada, as used in Pali or Prakrit, or Anatmavada. The doctrine of non-existence of Atman is one of the core teachings, tenets of Buddhism. Because they strongly believe, they assert that there is nothing permanent in this universe. Everything is changing. So there's an important, so Anatmavada is an important term in mainstream Buddhism. So that is the philosophical context. Now Vyasa writes in his commentary, and he actually makes some very interesting analogies and comparisons. That's why this bhashya is very often considered to be one of among the most graphic descriptions of the fundamental teachings of yoga system. Bhashya yatha pravrishi trinangurasya udbhedena tad bijasatta animiyate tatha mokshamaggasravanena yasya ramahashasruvadu drishyede tatrapi asti vishesha darsana bijam apavargabhagiyam karmabhir nivartidam iti anumiyate. It's a very interesting. So the point is, what happens? See. So now suppose it starts raining. Then what happens? If you look around during rainy season, so pravrishi actually means during rainy season, pravrishabda. There may be many seeds on this earth, but you understand there were seeds only when you see the sprouts coming up during rainy season. So only from the sprouting of different types of vegetation from the earth, which happens only in rainy season, you can actually infer. So the inference is one of the tools in epistemology, and both in the old Aristotelian logic and also Indian logic. So Indian logic, of course, this Anumana has got different dimensions. So Vyasa says, when a person listens to some higher teachings, let us say, for example, you are living in this world, you have a lot of money. I'm trying to put in modern context. You had a great job, plenty of friends, everything going on fine. And one day you go to the university library, you take up a book, some wonderful book, and that book tells you something about some transcendental higher way of life, some higher principles, God or mysticism, Atman, Vedanta, or anything. Who will be interested in that? Only those who have the seeds of previous Samskaras. Those who have inherited some spiritual tendencies from previous life. Those tendencies are suddenly brought to the surface. They are activated when they read some great books. Then only an interest in something that they are not able to see in front of them can emerge. See, you may be interested in a car because you are seeing plenty of advertisements in YouTube. When you travel in the city, you can see many places selling exotic cars and vehicles and so on. So you may be interested. But to be interested in Vedanta, in spiritual life, which you cannot see anywhere, how can you be interested in Vedanta? Because there is nothing in this world that can actually excite you or prompt you to take an interest in spiritual life. Every experience in this world actually is designed to convince you that there is no God. This world is the only reality. Money is the only thing you should care for. So every time you see all the advertisements, they are all designed to drag your mind and senses towards various worldly objects. They are not designed to take you to higher spiritual life. But still some people, fortunately, get this inclination to spiritual life. Why? Because there are seeds in their system, Samskaras, healthy spiritual Samskaras. Just like there are seeds on this earth. So when it starts raining, suddenly you can see different plants coming up. They start sprouting and become plants and trees eventually. It's all because there are seeds. So suppose it starts raining and maybe within a few days you suddenly find a mango plant sprouting, mango sprout plant, small plant coming up. It means there was a mango seed there. Similarly, if a person reads a book, listens to some great ideas related to something that is not empirical, something that is related to spiritual life, it's only a proof. Of course, proof in this is anumana, and inference is, as I mentioned, pratyaksha, anumana, umana, shabda, arthabhati, anupalabdhi. These are the 6 pramanas in Hindu epistemology. Pratyaksha means direct perception, anumana means inference. Then there is, of course, the comparison, analogy, and then there is verbal testimony, there is a presumption, which is actually an extension of anumana in a different way. And of course, when you understand there is not a chair, is anupalabdhi, you understand, you are informed, you get the knowledge about the absence of the chair. That also is an inference. So that is also one of the epistemological tools. Anupalabdhi means non-existence is now perceived. So negation is also one of the proofs in Hindu epistemology. This is extended further, of course, according to Pauranikas, according to some other schools of philosophy. They extend the pramanas, the epistemological tools to 10th. So if you are interested, you can ask me questions. I have discussed this on many occasions. You can, if you are interested in epistemology, you can ask questions later. Buddhism, Jainism, each of them have different tools of epistemology. So the point is, here, Bhashya, the Bhashyakara Vyasa says, Pravrishi Trinangurasya Udbhedena. Trinangura means, sprouting of vegetation, sprouting of some plant or something. It actually breaks through the upper layer of the earth, that is Udbheda, and comes to the surface. And you call it a sprout or a plant. So, tad bija satta anumiyate. From there you understand there was a seed under this earth, which you didn't see before it started raining. Tatha moksha sravanena. Similarly, when you get some connection, some access to some sort of a idea related to moksha, means liberation, we can say the ultimate spiritual value. It's difficult to explain what moksha actually implies. In its most earthly sense, when you have plenty of money, when everything going on fine for you, and then suddenly you feel, oh, all these things are meaningless. Maybe an ungrateful friend or collapse of the banks, loss of money, loss of near and dear ones, all these sometimes remind us of the limitation of all that we value in this empirical world. At that time you think of something transcendental. That is actually the opening door to moksha. Moksha means liberation, going beyond the transmigratory cycles of birth, life, death and rebirth. This is moksha. But you think of this moksha only when you have the seed that is already planted in the mental system, and that comes only as a result of some previous experiences, previous spiritual struggles from previous life cycles. So you have to accept, you have to interpret this only in the light of the doctrine of reincarnation, rebirth, and also the doctrine of law of karma. So Romahasha Asrupado Drishyeti. So some people, when they suddenly hear about, learn about some higher spiritual value, or there is something far beyond all these things that you are seeing around you. All this money, wealth, health, everything will come and go, but there is something which will never perish, which is everlasting, which is immortal. When you hear that, Vyasa says, our hairs will stand on its end and we will start. Santosha Asru actually means the tears of joy. Unfortunately, people think that tears are always a sign of misery, but there are some sort of tears which actually show indicate a great joy. That is called, Roma Harsha Asruvada. When you get excited, then hair will stand on its end and tears will start pouring out of your eyes because of this joy. Of course, only some very blessed people will have this sort of experience. Drishyede tatrabi asti vishesha darsana bija apavarga bhagiyam. So, when you get this discerning wisdom, which is called Vishesha Darshana, and that discerning wisdom is the seed that leads you out of these transmigratory cycles of birth, life, enjoyment, death and rebirth, and these continuing cycles of life and death and rebirth. You get out of this prison house. That is apavarga, means moksha. Apavarga is moksha. So what happens is, then karma bhi nirvartidam anumiyate. And then what happens is, you actually get out of these cycles of life and death and rebirth. So now what happens is, then you get total freedom from all sorts of inner conflicts and confusions. Otherwise, Atma Bhava Bhavana Nivritti. So Atma Bhava Bhavana actually means, people have this skeptical approach. Is there something beyond this world? People talk about God and spirituality which I cannot see in front of me, which I cannot experience the way I am experiencing empirical worldly things. So is there such a thing as Atman? Is there such a thing as liberation, as spiritual enlightenment? This kind of conflicts and confusions, mental blocks, all these will come to an end when you get this correct discerning wisdom, which is called in this sutra as Vishesha Darshana, means a proper discerning wisdom and understanding of the fact that there is Atman, which is eternal, which is self-effulgent, And that Atman is something trans-empirical. It is not this mind. Mind is actually a wavering, a changing entity. Everything that is related to the mind changes. We are happy now and unhappy later. So this mind cannot be my true identity. My true identity should be something, we want it to be something other than this mind. Actually, to be very frank with you, it is a terrible tragedy if we think that we are this body and mind. Actually, it is a self-impoverishing idea. A billionaire saying that he has no money, and he may have billions of dollars in the bank, may be owning many restaurants, and he says he's starving because he has no money to buy, and he is perhaps living on, special tickets that are given to people who have nothing to subsist on, and we suddenly we hypnotize ourselves into thinking that we are all beggars, we are all impoverished, bankrupt people. Actually, we have billions of dollars in the bank, spiritually speaking. But we disown ourselves. We reject our own spiritual inheritance. And we hypnotize ourselves into thinking that I have nothing, I'm begging in the streets. So that's what is happening. So that kind of confusion, that kind of self-defeating confusion, wavering, conflict, skepticism, and intellectual bankruptcy, all these combined is called Atma Bhava Bhavana, means total confusion. We are still not sure whether I am this body or something other than that. So actually, people who tell you that you are only this body, there is no such thing as spirituality, everything is matter. Actually, they are not your best friends, because they are like people who tell a billionaire, you have nothing, so go and start begging in the streets. They are not your best friends. They are actually denying our real spiritual inheritance. That's the implication. So what we should do, we should always try to discover our own spiritual inheritance. In fact, everyone in this world, maybe 8 billion people, close to 8 billion people, that's total population now on this earth. Each and every person will have some sort of spiritual inheritance. You cannot find a single human being with this zero bank balance of spiritual culture. If we introspect ourselves, somewhere at the deeper layers of our mental system, there should be something noble, some healthy samskaras, vasanas, tendencies and impressions. We should try to connect with our own spiritual inheritance. That's why Lord Krishna says, Purvabhyasena tenaiva hriyadevi avashopi saka jijñāsurapayogasya sabda brahmadi vartati. The 6th chapter, Lord Krishna says, people suddenly get attracted or drawn to spiritual ideas. That's because Purvabhyasa means in their previous life cycles, they have practiced on the strength of their own spiritual tendencies that they have accumulated in the mental system. They are able to continue their spiritual journey in this present life. From where they have left in their previous life cycles, they can continue their spiritual journey in this life. So that's why, and that spiritual culture is called Apavarga Bhagiyam. That spiritual culture leads us to our own spiritual liberation. Apavarga means moksha. So, karmabhi nirvartidam iti animiyate. Tasya atma bhava bhavana swabhaviki pravartade. So, such persons will have a natural inclination towards some transcendental spiritual practices or ideas. This happens because they have already deposited some spiritual culture in their mental system. And in this life, when they read a book or when they listen to some higher ideas related to spirituality or liberation or something, immediately it's like you hit a rock and suddenly a spring opens up and you get plenty of water. Sri Ramakrishna gives this interesting analogy, people trying to dig a well, they go on digging, there's no water, and suddenly, accidentally, one of the workers digging the well happens to hit a rock, and immediately a big spring comes up and the whole well is filled with water. Similarly, at some point we may feel a kind of inner connection with something transcendental, though we cannot recollect having practiced any spiritual discipline in this life. But at some point, accidentally, maybe by associating with some spiritual persons, by reading a book on spirituality, suddenly the spring opens up and then our mind is filled with spiritual ideas. So for that, we need to emphasize not only intellectual intelligence, so-called IQ, but also emotional intelligence. So there is a great danger in not possessing emotional intelligence. We should try to refine our mental system, our emotions and feelings, by connecting our mind to some higher ideas. Then slowly vrittis, vasanas, samskaras, tendencies are all refined. They get a sublimation, and then what happens? We get a new connection with some higher transcendental value. That's why the journey of spiritual life is not in the world of concepts and ideas, but in the world of samskaras, which are related to emotional intelligence and not intellect or intelligence as we normally understand in terms of intellectual faculty. Anyway, this is a subject that we can discuss. If you have got any doubt, we can ask during interaction. Coming back to Bhashya, because this Bhashya is very, very well known, so I thought I must give importance to this. Tasya atma bhava bhavana swabhaviki pravartate. So, swabhaviki means natural. Suddenly, you find you're turning a corner in your spiritual journey. A man may have led a wayward life till his 30th year, 40th year, 50th year, sometimes up to 90 years. And suddenly, there is a turning point. These turning points are very important. Of course, there are some exceptional great people. They are born with these natural spiritual tendencies. But unfortunately, for many people, this transformation takes place at a much later stage in life. So as well in Gaudavada's Mandika Karya, there is a interesting verse. Anadi maya supto yatha jiva prabuddhide ajam anidrama swapnam advaidam vidyate tatha. So anadi maya supta means we are all asleep in spiritual slumber, and suddenly there is an awakening, and this awakening happens when accidentally or otherwise we happen to connect with some higher transcendental idea, and that process is called Vishesha Darshanam in this particular sutra. Yasya abhava idamuktam subhavam muktva doshat yesham purvapakshi ruchi bhavati aruchischa nirnaye bhavati. Now Vyasa is giving the opposite picture. Yasya abhavat, those who do not have this natural spiritual inclination, which is the result of our own spiritual disciplines that we practiced in our previous life cycles. When we do not have this natural inclination, what happens, then we will have an inclination, we will have an interest in the opposite of spiritual tendencies. I mean, our mind will be automatically, naturally inclined towards worldly objects. That's called Purvapaksha here. They mean the opposite direction. Those who have already got some spiritual seeds on the mental system, like seeds which are hidden, invisible under the earth. We sprout only when it starts raining. Similarly, when we have the spiritual seeds, tendencies, which are natural inclinations in our mental system, then they come to the surface and they sprout, they become plants, trees, and they themselves start producing fruits. But in the absence of those tendencies, nothing will grow. There are, of course, sometimes, when it starts raining, you don't find every inch of the earth suddenly giving sprouts. Sprouting of vegetation can happen only if there is a seed, some kind of a seed under the earth. Unfortunately, sometimes there can be poisonous seeds also. Poisonous plants also will grow up. So you find that under certain circumstances, in certain stages in our life, there is a wayward, unfortunately there is a tendency to move in the opposite direction. That also happens because in the previous life cycles, there are some negative samskaras, negative tendencies, negative impressions which are already accumulated in the mental system as a result of our own wrong actions, worldly ambitions. Then those tendencies also can sprout. So when it starts raining, then only you will understand whether there's a mango seed, there's some kind of seed, what kind of seeds were there, they were under this earth. You get a clear idea only when it starts raining. So sometimes under certain circumstances, there could be the unfortunate possibility of wrong types of tendencies suddenly sprouting in our mind, and they can take us in the opposite direction. That possibility is pointed out by Vyasa in this commentary. That is, Purvapakshe Ruchit Bhavati, mean a tendency for the wrong things, an inclination for the wrong things. Tatra Atmabhava Bhavana. But then that is, of course, just as a possibility. When a person really gets this natural inclination to a spiritual life as a result of some kind of encounter with those ideas, maybe reading a book from the library, or have maybe a meeting with a spiritually enlightened person, maybe because of listening to some higher ideas, suddenly the invisible seed begins to sprout. And then you ask the question, Kohamasam, well, Katamahamasam, it means you start asking this question, who was I? And what is this body? How did it come into being? Katamahamasam, Kim Sididam, Kadanjididam means, what is this world? Who am I? What is this body? And how did this body come to this world? What's my true nature? What am I going to become? What will be my future? These real questions about one's own existence and the mystery of human life, that can happen only to those who have slightly evolved in their spiritual life. Otherwise, people, if you have a problem, if you have kind of conflict, people go and start drinking, take drugs, and indulge in many other sometimes undesirable things. Most people don't go and sit somewhere and read Aristotle, asking the question, who am I? What's my nature? What's the mystery of life? There are not too many, but of course there are still a great many people who do that. That's why the world is still surviving as a as a place worthy of living on, you see. So that's why Vyasa is putting the whole thing in a very graphic language. Suddenly you ask this question: who was I? What was I in my previous life? And who am I right now? What is this body of mine? And how did all this come about? So he asking the question: Kohamasam, Katamahamasam, Kimsit idam, Kadamsit idam, and then Ke Bhavishyama, and what is going to happen to all of us? What will happen to me in future? All these questions. If you just think of the great mystics, many, not all, but great many mystics, at some point in their life, they asked these questions. So they became great. And Buddha himself is maybe the grandest example. He was married and he had a happy life. He was living in a palace. One day he encountered the dark realities of life, like death, old age and sickness. And he started asking this question: who am I? What's the meaning of this life? Is there such a thing as old age and sickness? He was forced to live a life, and he forced to live under certain circumstances, which denied any opportunity for him to encounter the darker realities of life, like old age, death or anything. So one day it really happened. He saw a dead body being taken to cremation ground. He saw a sick man. He's an old man. So old age, death and sickness, terrible things in life. And that made him think about the meaning of life and existence. And that is the beginning of his spiritual journey. And he became Buddha. So this is an interesting example of what Vyasa is now talking about. I mean, suddenly you happen to turn a corner in your spiritual journey. When this happens, he says, Katham va bhavishyamaidi, what will happen to me? What am I going to become in future? Satu. Sadmi here means all these waverings of mind, all these conflicts. Satu visheshadasyino nivartate kutaha. Now, when you get this discerning wisdom, I mean, when you get this real experience, not just an intellectual conviction, but a real experience. Intellectual conviction is very helpful, but intellectual conviction should actually become our emotional attitude. Then only it actually endures our life. Intellect is superficial compared to emotions. Most people live at the level of the mind and emotions and feelings and attitudes. So, intellectual convictions are important, but there is a distance we have to travel from intellect to emotions. Then only it becomes part of our emotional intelligence. So, and that requires spiritual practice to bridge the gap between the world of emotions or the world of mind and the world of intellect. Satu visheshadasyano nivartade kutaha chittasya esha vijitra parinamaha. Then what happens is, when you reach this stage in life, this point of transformation, turning a corner in our life, what happens? you really get the full conviction, and that conviction is not an intellectual construct. It becomes an emotional feeling. We call realization. Well, all these phenomena, all these worldly objects, they are just modifications of mind. Our likes and dislikes, our extreme infatuation and extreme aversion to certain things, raga and dvesha, and abhinivesha. These are kleshas. These are all created by the kleshas, which again are created by avidya. Avidya means the absence of proper wisdom, absence of vishesha darsana. So when you turn the corner, when this transformation really happens, you get the full conviction, well, all these things really don't mean much. In fact, this happens to many people, but it doesn't last long, because it's again at the surface, just an intellectual construct. When our near and dear ones die, suddenly we encounter the reality of somebody altogether disappearing from our experience, from our vision. Then we understand, oh, there is something, where did he go? Where did she go? And perhaps I may also go one day like that. So suddenly the possibility of that happening to the person, but this doesn't remain in our mind for too long. Otherwise, a person who is managing a crematorium, a doctor who is treating patients in a hospice, he can become a great philosopher. He can become a Buddha if he wants. He really understands this, but it remains at the surface of the intellect for some time. It doesn't become an attitude at a deeper level. If it becomes, he can become a Buddha. So that's why chittasya esha vichitra parinamaha. All these empirical experiences, the entire phenomenal worldly objects, these all constitute different evolutes of chitta, and they keep changing. They are not eternal, but Purusha is eternal. So Purusha means Atman is eternal. Purushastu asatyam avidyayam shuddha chitta dharmaihi aparamrishtaha. Purusha or Atman, our true identity, it remains untouched, unaffected by all these changing worldly phenomena. Purusha remains unchanging. That's our true identity. So if you read Vivekananda's interpretations, Swamiji always connects these ideas to Vedanta, because these ideas make sense only when you connect it to Vedanta. So Swami Vivekananda's interpretation is actually much more readable, and it actually brings out the real meaning, spiritual implications of Yoga Sutra literature, Yoga Sutras, because Swamiji interprets this in the context of Vedanta. And that is true with regard to most of the commentators belonging to the non-Buddhist tradition, because in the Buddhist traditions, very often, these same teachings of yoga were used as a method for disciplining the mind, making the mind stable, and then slowly detaching ourselves from the mind and going beyond the mind. But beyond towards what? That question was never answered in the Buddhist literature. Of course, that is a different subject that is related to the dialectical warfare that took place between 1st century AD and 6th or 7th century AD between different schools of philosophy in India. This is a different subject. Those who are interested, you can ask questions during interaction.
tataha asya atma bhava bhavana kusalasya nivartate iti. Therefore, all these doubts, that is atma bhava bhavana, people who have got a lot of skepticism, doubts and conflicts with regard to what they actually are. All these conflicts are completely gone. There is a complete cessation of all these conflicts when that spiritual seeker attains this Vishesha Darshana. This is a very well-known part of the Vyasa's commentary, Vyasa Bhashya in the yoga literature. Now we will come to the next one. The next sutra is Tada Viveka Nimnam Kaivalya Pragbhavam Chittam. So this idea continues. The idea that Chittam or mind is something that is changing all the time, so it cannot be the absolute reality, as held by the Vijnanavadins or Yogachara philosophers. Chittam is only one of the evolutes of Prakriti, and it is something changing. Behind the Chittam, behind the mind, there is one unchanging reality, and that is Purusha, that is Atman, that's our true identity. And all our spiritual disciplines are designed to take us towards this true identification of our true nature. Tada, that means when our mind, tada means then, that's a real meaning, English sense in meaning. Tada here means when we realize this truth as a result of this Vishesha Darshana. So this should be read in the context of previous sutra. Tada here means when that happens, when this Vishesha Darshana, when this proper understanding comes, Viveka Nimnam, then our mind, which is gravitating towards proper wisdom, proper understanding, Viveka Nimnam, Kaivalya Pragbhavam. What happens, then it reaches the penultimate stage of spiritual liberation. All confusions, all doubts disappear, and Viveka and Vairagya reach their fulfillment, and mind becomes slowly calm and quiet, and it becomes serene. Because when we stop identifying ourselves with our mind, practically mind becomes our friend. Mind becomes our enemy only if you take your mind too seriously. So this is a simple thing. Suppose we feel too skeptical, lot of conflicts, anxieties and worries, all this happen in our mind. At that time, you try to watch all these things happening in your mind. So you try to detach yourself from your own mind. Then you find all these conflicts slowly come down. If you identify yourself with every emotion, every bit of anxiety that emerges in your mind, then you can't sleep. Especially in some kinds of melancholia and maniacal problems, this is what really happens. The fleeting of the mind and the continuous flow of conflicting thought currents, and mind trying to be obsessed with every single changing, conflicting thought currents. Such a person becomes restless. And mind produces too much of energy, and he is not able to contain his own energy system. Of course, this can happen due to wrong types of pranayamas also. This can happen because breathing can directly impact our mind. So, now what happens is, when we try to identify with every thought that emerges in our mind all the time, then we can't sleep. You won't be able to enjoy peace, serenity, calmness, or quietude. But you try to ignore your own mind, then you find mind is not a problem. You don't take your mind too seriously, mind is not a problem. But if you take your mind too seriously, then mind won't let you sleep for a moment. So, actually when you don't take your mind too seriously, you're actually trying to go beyond your mind. You're trying to identify yourself with something higher than the mind, other than your mind. And when that happens, your mind becomes calm and quiet. So this is what is happening in mindfulness, but still they refuse to admit the reality of an unchanging Atman beyond and behind the mind, because that subject was never really addressed by Buddha, because of maybe Buddha did not want to indulge in dialectical debates or discussions. Maybe that was not the purpose of his mission, because he came to give a humanistic interpretation of Vedanta philosophy, as Swami Vivekananda expressed again and again. Now, next one, sutra is Tachidreshu Pratyandirani Samskarebhya. Okay, now, see what happens, this, when Tat here, the word Tat Chidreshu Pratyandirani Samskarebhya, this Tat here means this obstructing samskaras, which actually mislead us into believing in the reality of these changing worldly objects. These are the obstructing samskaras. When these obstructing samskaras are completely neutralized, then what happens is you feel a kind of inner fulfillment, inner contentment. And when that happens, what really is happening is you become totally identified with your own Atman. So this is the implication of this. Tachidreshu. Tachidreshu means there are certain chitta vrittis which are actually emerging as a result of the neutralization of obstructing samskaras. When we identify ourselves with our mind, with every thought emerging in our mind, and when we wrongly believe that mind is everything, then there will be a lot of conflicts, problems, and anxieties and worries. On the other hand, when we realize that this mind is not the ultimate reality, this mind is only a changing evolute of Prakriti, and the reality, our true identity is Purusha, that is behind and beyond this mind. At that time what happens is we get an inner fulfillment. So that's why the commentators will quote this Yam labdhva chaparam labham manyadena adhigam tadha yasmin sidona dukkhena guruna vijalide tam vidya dukkha samyoga viyogam yoga samidam. In the Gita, yoga is mentioned here. Through this practice of yoga, you reach a point where you feel that you have attained something beyond which there is nothing more to achieve. You attain something, and that attainment gives you total fulfillment, total contentment. And when this happens, the Vyuthana Samskara emerges. Vyuthana Samskara, Nirodha Samskara. This subject discussed earlier. If you read another important sutra, those who have got the text, you can refer to this sutra. The sutra comes in this Yes. Ninth Sutra of Vibhudipada, the previous, ninth Sutra, Vitthana, Nirodha, Samskarayohu, Abhibhava Pradurbhavu, Nirodhakshana Vichittanyayo, Nirodha Parinamaha. It's a very important sutra that we discuss very elaborately. Vitthana Samskara. Vitthana Samskara actually means two types of samskaras, good and bad, keeping our mind always in a state of instability. And that Vitthana Samskara can be neutralized, can be defeated by Nirodha Samskara. Nirodha Samskara means a samskara or a tendency, mental tendency, that helps you to do Nirodha, to go beyond, to transcend these Vitthana Samskaras. Suddenly you may feel a great joy. After some time it is gone. Again you feel a great contentment. Again it is gone, the opposite. So different conflicting samskaras emerging from time to time. This actually keeps our mind in a state of instability. That's the main reason why people very often are not able to retain their sense of contentment. For some time they feel satisfied, but after some time it is gone. Nirodha Samskara helps you to neutralize these coming and going, but rather it takes you beyond these Vitthana Samskaras. So that's a subject. Of course, now we have interaction. It's already getting too late. So you can ask questions. We'll continue the discussion of this subject in the next session. You can now ask questions. Most welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
The raise hand feature is already in play. I've scanned Facebook and I have scanned the YouTube chat as well as the Zoom chat. But first in order was the question from YouTube, and that was about the Vibhudipada, the cities, and the question is, how do the cities work?
How do?
I think they're
Siddhis. Okay.
Yes, I think the question is an interest in the special powers.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, we will discuss this in the 28th Sutra, 28 to 29, because there are two editions. Actually, that happens. Prasankhyanepi akusidasya sarvatha viveka khyadehe dharma megha samadhihi. So, people who become totally disinterested, even in prasankhyana viveka khyadi, they alone attain the highest. So, of course, coming back to the subject directly. So, vibhudis are the natural byproducts of our spiritual practices. Natural byproducts. So, actually, you don't sell your byproducts. At least that's not the main product you are selling. You don't start a factory just to market your byproducts. Your main purpose is to market the main product. But there's a difference. In the normal commercial life, you also try to dispose of byproducts for some money, some cheaper rates, etc. But in Yoga Sutra, these byproducts should be completely ignored. So those who focus on vibhudis, siddhis, anima, garima, laghima, mahima, etc., these are mentioned, they get stuck halfway in their journey. Not only that, another great danger is, and of course, in spiritual life, even if you read newspapers, if you keep your eyes open, very often people get into difficulties, problems, in their spiritual life, because they become victims of their own spiritual disciplines. So you may be, when you practice yamas and niyamas and meditations, naturally these practices generate certain faculties. They need not be taken to be supernatural. They are very natural. You need not use the word supernatural. There is no such thing as supernatural in yoga. They are very natural. Even at physical level, you can see the great athletes, martial artists, great players, great sportsmen. They reach some level of excellence in their own chosen areas, which for an amateur, somebody who is not at all interested in those things, maybe an ignorant person may think these are some supernatural. Nothing supernatural. This is an important thing to remember. So there is a great truth in what modern agnostics tell you. There is no such thing as supernatural in Vedanta or yoga. There is no such thing as a miracle. Miracle itself is a wrong concept. When you get some higher faculties as a result of your practice of disciplines, and what happens? They are the results of those disciplines that you practice. So you can see a cause-effect link. Then where is the supernatural? See, even though, suppose you practice yamas and niyamas, ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, parigraha, sauja, santosha, tapasva, dhyayisa, pridhana. Just the first two of the Ashtanga yoga, I mean, non-violence, non-stealing, non-possessiveness, pure life, contentment, and so on. When a person sincerely practices all these great values, you find his personality undergoes a change. His lifestyle undergoes a change, and that will have an impact on the people around, those who associate with him. And we immediately think this man is supernatural. So this is an important discipline. Now coming to the subject you mentioned, those who are highly impressed by the byproducts, by the vibhudis, by the siddhis, they not only get stuck there, their forward journey is blocked once for all, and then they start moving backward. That's a tragedy of it. That movement the backward movement is sometimes interpreted as deviations from yoga, and unfortunately, many things that we read about that happens to people. I don't want to go further into these subjects, but the point is all because they get stuck by the siddhis, really speaking. So a true spiritual seeker will completely ignore that. That's the explanation. Yeah.
Very helpful, Maharaj, very helpful. Vignesh had his hand up, and then David.
Yeah.
Vignesh, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah.
Hello, Maharaj.
Yeah.
Maharaj, so you mentioned that only when it rains we will know if there is a mango seed or there is another, what else is there, right? So when someone obtains this Vishesha Darshana and is able to, he or she gets interested in these, in the spiritual progress, and then tends to develop these additional faculties. But at the same time, there are other repressed tendencies which also begin to come out. Could this be dangerous?
No, actually these repressed tendencies, undesirable tendencies manifesting cannot be called Vishesha Darshana. Because Vishesha Darshana has a definite meaning. It means what it tells you is, well, I am not this mind. I am not this bundle of emotions and feelings and desires, extreme likes and dislikes and infatuations and aversions. I am something beyond all that. So you're able to lift yourself, your own identity beyond your mind. So that actually gives you a spiritual wisdom. So such persons will not allow to be affected by any depressed tendencies. He will have a mechanism, he will develop an inner mechanism to restrain the emergence of undesirable tendencies. This is an important thing. So remember, Vishesha Darsana happens only at an advanced stage. Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, and then Sampragnata Samadhi, various forms, just before Sampragnata Samadhi. So it's an advanced state. In fact, at the beginning itself, you are fully establishing yamas and niyamas. So even at that stage, most of the undesirable tendencies will be neutralized. And second point, remember, is even yamas and niyamas get more and more deep-rooted. You get established deeper and deeper in yamas and niyamas as you advance further. So it becomes literally, it becomes physically and psychologically impossible for you to do anything evil or wrong or immoral when you reach that stage. So the question of making special efforts to block the emergence of undesirable tendencies, the question doesn't arise here. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
David?
Yeah, please.
I hope you asked the question
Yeah.
that I think you're going to ask.
Yeah, please, David. Yeah, please.
Hi, Swami. I had a question. You were talking about, that one has to have the seeds. And I guess my question is, like, how does one get the seeds? Like, what if one has no seeds? I remember Dr. Sarkar said, well, if I get to the stage where a brickbat, I'll just go back to become a brickbat again. You know, that how does one get the seed to begin with? Like, what if one has no spiritual samskaras whatsoever? You know, that how does one ever get the seed? Especially because Sri Ramakrishna, at one point, I remember him saying that everyone is going to God eventually. You know, but I don't understand that. It seems some people are going the opposite direction, and and how do they get the seed?
Yeah, actually here the possibility of going the opposite direction, that was referred to. Vyasa doesn't say we are moving the opposite direction. Aruji means Prabhupaksha means a tendency to move in the opposite direction can emerge if we don't take special care to move in the right direction. So it's a different. When I was coming to the subject, actually we can analyze our own mind by analyzing our interests, our areas of interests, really speaking. Without some seeds, without some practice in previous life or in this life, some time in the past or in this life, we cannot take even an intellectual interest in higher things, because we are not seeing anything in front of us. When you, as I mentioned, when you go to a shop selling cars, you are seeing a car in front of you, you may have a tendency to buy it or maybe not to buy it, of course. But here, in spiritual matters, you are not seeing anything in front of you. But still, a person accidentally happens to see a copy of Bhagavad Gita or the Bible Sermon on the Mount or maybe Dhammapada. Suddenly he gets connected. He feels a kind of inner connection, and then he feels that, well, I have to come back to this again. That shows the seed, there is already a seed there, is beginning to sprout. So there is nobody in the world without a little bit of this positive spiritual seed. But very often people don't get an opportunity to connect with their own inheritance. According to Vedanta, at some stage it will happen. So, especially, I can just imagine, I can give you an example. In modern times, students studying in schools, maybe not even universities, do not get any chance to get any acquaintance with spiritual or mystical ideas, higher ideas. They are always, they are connecting, they are always interested in something that produces an immediate material benefit. Why should you read Emerson? Why should you go to a forest or a lonely place or maybe Olima retreat and read a copy of Emerson? It doesn't give you any benefit. If you do some work, maybe every hour means $25, $100, $200 per hour you get. So you don't really see any benefit in reading that. But still some people do that. Knowing fully well it's a waste of, for others, a waste of time. But for some people, it is a very precious way of utilizing their time. That's because there is another kind of seed in their system. But still, for school, suppose you make mysticism, transcendentalism in America's context is an important subject for students to study. Some students have some seed somewhere will sprout, maybe not during their time in the school, maybe at a later time, later event. Because when you plant a seed, when you sow a seed, sometime, somewhere, maybe not in this life, next life, it will sprout. So, if you give when it starts raining, wherever there is a seed, some seed will sprout. So, there is nobody in the world with some spiritual seed in their inheritance, in their cultural, spiritual, psychological inheritance, so to speak, samskaras and tendencies, vrittis. So we cannot produce seeds. We can, but even the tendency to produce more healthy spiritual samskaras, it requires some background of previous samskaras. That most people have, but they don't get an opportunity. There is no rains there. It's all dry land. Modern schools. You don't water the Mother Earth, So it's all rocky surface. So there are seeds maybe, but they don't get a chance to sprout. That's what we can say about modern educational system, really speaking. Yeah.
Thank you, Maharaj. David, you're the end of the queue, so if you have a follow-up question... oh wait, another hand has gone up, but I've already invited you to ask a follow-up if you were so inclined.
Yeah, please.
So basically, Swami, that everybody has some seed.
Yeah.
And so when Sri Ramakrishna says eventually, so some people are going meandering downward, but eventually they'll turn around and come upward?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
But is that grace? Like, why do some people choose a spiritual teacher who is kind of a less than authentic, and other people choose a more authentic spiritual teacher?
Yeah, that's again related to the previous karmas. Again, this can only be understood in the context of the law of karmas. Some previous connections have made them ready and fit for a more intimate way of practicing spiritual disciplines. And some people may be a little behind, so they may need a few more life cycles. But even if you read one good book with all seriousness for half an hour in one's full life, pray or meditate or think of something higher once in life, that will not go waste. That will be a foundation from which you can build up your edifice, your structure. That's purvabhyasena tenaiva. So Lord Krishna says, you will be helpless, you will be forced to continue your spiritual journey if you have already deposited some spiritual samskaras in your system. That's it. Yeah.
David, I want to answer that question, not like Swamiji, but my own journey. So, when I started, I was following some gurus or something like that, and then eventually I thought, as I evolved, I felt, like finally I got introduced into Vedanta, and now I don't follow any of the other spiritual, like the other gurus or anything. Now I feel I'm able to transition to Vedanta. That's how I feel that this is the ultimate for me. So that's my transition journey.
Thank you, Arati. Yogi, you're next.
Yeah.
Maharaj.
Yeah.
In Vedanta, Atman is described as Sat Chit Ananda.
Yeah.
How is Purusha described in Sankhya?
Yeah, in Sankhya system, Purusha is described as self-effulgent, Chaitanya, Chaitanat. So, the concept of Purusha in Sankhya system is not very elaborate. First of all, the authentic literature on Sankhya system is very, very limited. All that we have got as a fundamental text is Ishwara Krishna Sankhya Karika, which gives a very, very brief description of Sankhya system. So we get to know more about Sankhya system only from Vedantic text. But Vedantic philosophers agreeing with a lot of the details of Sankhya system totally rejects the conclusions of Sankhya system, which is essentially dualism. So Sankhya concept of Purusha is self-effulgent, is aware of it, and Purusha is self-effulgent. Prakriti is not self-effulgent. Prakriti is active, Purusha is inactive but self-effulgent. So both they come together. That's how creation takes place. And as a result of this, we identify ourselves with the evolutes of Prakriti when through what we may call reverse evolution, that is called Pradiprasava. Eventually we dehypnotize ourselves. We de-identify ourselves with the external world, with tanmatras, with ahankaras, with buddhi. Eventually we come to Prakriti level. Finally we de-identify, we stop identifying ourselves with Prakriti. Then we realize that we are Purusha, of true nature. This is called Vishesha Darsana, actually called. Now the point is, Sankhya system or Yoga system, both philosophically they are more or less identical, are important only for one important reason, and there's a very important reason. Yoga psychology is fully accepted in Vedanta system. Yoga psychology is accepted not only in Advaita Vedanta, even Ramanuja, Madhva, all this, they are accepted. Only when the question of one absolute reality or more than one absolute reality, then only there is a difference between Advaita and non-Advaitic Vedanta systems like Ramanuja, Madhva, Vallabha, Nimbarka and so on. So this is an important thing to remember. The details of Yoga Sankhya system with regard to mind, buddhi, ahankara, tanmatras, panchamahabhutas, all these are fully accepted in Vedanta. All Vedantas, they call Samana Siddhanta, they are more or less similar. But conclusions are rejected by Advaitins. So there's a great difference between the Atman, which is Satchidananda, the absolute existence, absolute knowledge or consciousness, absolute bliss of Advaita, and Purusha in Sankhya Yoga system, which is only described as self-effulgent. It is Chaitanavat. That's all.
Quick follow-up, Maharaj.
Yeah.
Since through Purusha and or Prakriti, neither one of them have Ananda. Where does the Ananda come from in Sankhya Yoga systems?
Actually, when we stop identifying ourselves with the evolutes of Prakriti, then we get our true identity, this Purusha. So that experience itself is a fulfillment. So there is no, Purusha is not described as Satchidananda.
If you read Swami Vivekananda, you have to remember Swamiji is connecting the Purusha concept of yoga system with Atman of Advaita. So Swamiji's description of Purusha is sometimes like the Atman of Advaita. In fact, that's the only sensible way of making sense of Purusha concept. So Purusha is not Satchidananda according to yoga system. But when you get your true identity, that is Purusha, then you feel your fulfillment. In that sense, Ananda is there. And Purusha is the only, is your true identity. In that sense, Sat is there. And Purusha is actually effulgence. In that sense, Chit also is there. That's all. But Purusha is not defined as Satchidananda. In Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, it is Tadastha Lakshana. Brahman or Atman cannot be defined. But there is an indirect way of making an attempt to define, that is Satchidananda. Vedanta.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you. Yeah.
Please go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. Yeah. Mark, please.
Yes, Pranam Maharaj.
Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could help me understand a statement of Ramakrishna's, Sri Ramakrishna's.
Yeah.
This is from Words of the Master.
Yeah.
It's from the chapter,
Yeah.
State of a Perfect Man.
Yeah.
He says, first ignorance, then knowledge. But both of these are relative.
Yeah.
When one comes to know the absolute,
Yeah.
one goes beyond the pale of both ignorance and knowledge.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to describe taking a thorn, one thorn to
Yeah.
take out another thorn and then throwing them
Yeah.
both away.
Yeah.
In my readings, a lot of the seekers always say, give me knowledge, banish ignorance, give me absolute knowledge. They're always asking to cultivate and have knowledge. But here Ramakrishna seems to say you have to go beyond knowledge.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could clarify that for me, because I don't really understand.
Yeah. You know, every definition in Vedanta is only an attempt to define something which cannot be defined. Everything is an approximation. So when we talk about knowledge and ignorance, this equation, it is at the approximation level. When you actually experience the reality, it cannot be even called knowledge, because when you use the word knowledge, it implies a possibility of something the opposite of knowledge. So I can give this explanation, I can explain this in the light of the well-known analogy, Rajju Sarpa Bhranti, the snake rope analogy. Suppose there's a room, that I will explain, many of the listeners may need this. Suppose there's a room, it's not well lit, there's little light, not enough, and there's a rope lying there. The rope can be misunderstood, mistaken to be a snake. Of course, according to Vedanta, Sarpa, Jaladhara, Bhuchidra, Danta, it can be mistaken to be a snake, a crack on the floor, or a stick, or maybe a stream of water, a thin stream of water. Anyway, coming to subject. So you may mistake that rope for a snake. And when you bring light, you open the windows, then you realize it is not a snake, but only a rope. Now question arises. Actually, what you earlier misunderstood to be the snake is now properly understood to be the rope. So the only rope is there. So the point is, when you actually get true knowledge as an experience, then the very concept of ignorance, knowledge, equation becomes irrelevant. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, Vedanta dictum is, Brahman is the only reality, this world is unreal. But at the same time, when you realize Brahman, then you understand Sarvam Khalidam Brahman, everything is Brahman. So the world is denied and called mithya only when you mistake this world of name and form, nama rupa, as an absolute reality. If you can still look at the world and still remember this only name and form, then you are not actually looking at the world as an entity. You are looking at the phenomenon in terms of name and form. See, after you have brought your light, now you understood it is only a rope, still you are looking at the object. So then you realize there is no need for you to say, no, this is not snake, it is only a rope. You don't have to say that. You understand it is rope. So the question of this is not the snake, it is only a rope, you don't make a statement. You make a statement only when there is a possibility of its opposite. See, you don't say I am Mark. It is obvious. You don't say I am Mark. It is obvious to you. But for somebody who may mistake you to be somebody else, no, he is not John, it is Mark, he may say. But once you know that I am Mark, I am not John, you don't say that. Why do you say? Because it's so well obvious. So there is an important statement in Vedanta, a famous statement, aprasaktasya ko nishedha, aprasaktasya ka prastavaha. Prasaktasya ko nishedha, prasaktasya ka prastavaha. So it means whatever is obvious, you don't deny it, you cannot deny it, but you don't have to affirm it. Whatever is self-evident, so obvious, you don't have to affirm it. You don't have to make a statement of anything which is self-evident, which is quite evident. When you actually reach that higher knowledge, the knowledge-ignorance equation, this conundrum, these differences do not exist. When a person reaches the highest experience, he sees the world, but he is not seeing the world as an ignorant man sees. When an ignorant man sees the world, he thinks, oh, this river, these mountains, the ocean, different things, names and forms and all that. But when a spiritually enlightened person, a liberated soul, looks at this world, he sees this world as non-distinct from Brahman. He looks at this world as something non-distinct from Brahman. Just as when you see the rope, you don't tell, no, this is not a snake. The snake idea becomes irrelevant. You don't have to deny the existence of snake because the idea itself becomes irrelevant. It disappears from you. So for the highest man of spiritual experience, there is no need for him to say this world is mithya, this world is unreal. For him, the world as such doesn't exist. The world in terms of name and form doesn't exist. For him, the world also is Brahman. But the way he sees this world is different. He sees this world as non-distinct from Brahman because he doesn't see the world as a complex of names and forms. So whatever is self-evident, you cannot deny, but you don't have to affirm it. It beyond denial, beyond affirmation. It is self-evident. So the highest knowledge Sri Ramakrishna is talking about goes beyond knowledge, ignorance equation. Knowledge, ignorance equation, lower level. At the spiritual level, the real knowledge, K you can put in K capital. That knowledge is a real experience. We use the word knowledge only in that sense, vijnana, experience, that's the word. A philosopher is at a lower level. A mystic is a higher level. A mystic is experiencing what the philosopher is trying to explain, not very unsuccessful. Philosopher really cannot explain. The truth, the absolute truth cannot be explained. But a mystic is really living what the philosopher is trying to define and explain. So when Sri Ramakrishna talks about a level where there is neither knowledge nor ignorance, he is talking about the level of experience. That's the idea. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Pranamastu.